Welcome back, Mindsetters. Hope you had a nice little break there. But make sure that you guys are still paying attention now. Make sure you have your pens, pads out, and you guys are making notes. You've gone and done whatever you had to do. You went to the bathroom. You went to go get snacks. Whatever you had to do, so you don't have to fidget or go anywhere. Because we're now going to get into the rest of the session. Mr. Aslam, and Mr. Aslam is actually going to take it away. Mr. Aslam, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ty. Guys, we just completed the life cycle in a moss, and the next example that we look at is the life cycle in an angiosperm. Angiosperm simply means literally covered seed. And in other words, these are plants where the seed is covered in an ovary. The seed is found inside the ovary. And as you would know, the ovary later becomes the fruit. So if anybody asks you whether you eat ovaries, you've got to answer in the positive, guys, because you eat a lot of fruit and the fruit is actually the ovary. So think about that every time you're eating a juicy mango. We're looking at the angiosperm as such. We'll start at the part that you and I know, obviously, because we consider the angiosperms or the flowering plants in that way. And we'll start with the flower itself. So the flower represents the whole plant itself. The adult plant that we see represents the mature sporophyte, which is diploid, as you can see there. And this particular plant, in this, the flower rather, that's in this here, obviously has both sexes on the same plant. They have the male part, there's the male parts there, one, this whole structure there, and this area here, the female part. Okay? So this would be a hermaphrodite flower, has both sexes on the same flower. The male part is made up of the filament and the anther, a stalk and an anther on the side there. The anther is bilobed, simply means that it has two lobes, and these lobes are lobed again. So altogether there'll be 4 lobes. Each lobe contains a pollen sac, as you can see there, and inside this pollen sac we're going to have pollen grains. Now what actually happens here? Inside the pollen sacs are microspore mother cells. Microspore mother cells. And these are diploid, obviously. They divide by meiosis. They divide by meiosis to give rise to a microspore. The microspore becomes eventually the pollen grain. And this pollen grain contains 2 nuclei. One is called the generative nuclei, and the other one is called the vegetative nucleus. Generative, coming from generation, is going to give rise to the next generation, so that would be the gamete. The vegetative nucleus is also called the tube nucleus. It gives rise to the pollen tube when the pollen lands on a suitable substrate. Now that's what's happening here. Pollination taking place, the pollen grain lands on the stigma, that comes to the female now. The female side is made up of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Inside the ovary are the ovules, and in every ovule there would be an ovum, one egg cell. But we're coming to that area just now. So all this is happening on the male side now, and let's look at the female side. The female side, the ovary has ovules, and the ovules have megaspore now, megaspore. Notice there by the pollen we spoke about microspore. Now we're talking about megaspore mother cell that divides by meiosis to give rise to the megaspore end. And this one here is a little more complicated than in the male. Here we have an embryo sac with different nuclei. Here we can see clearly the egg in the middle here, and on the side they have 2 other cells called the synergids. The one in the middle, egg. And here in this area we have what we call the endosperm cells. Okay, and on the other side of that, On the opposite end, we have 3 antipodal cells. Now, when the pollen grain lands on the stigma, the pollen tube starts growing into the style. And can you see here, there are the pollen tube, the nucleus will be there, and you have 2 other nuclei there. What happens when the pollen grain starts to germinate, the pollen tube, the male gamete divides by mitosis to duplicate itself. Now there are 2 male gametes. So when these cells come in to the embryo, or rather to the embryo sac itself, the one cell fuses with the egg cell, and the other one fuses with the polar nuclei. So we have a situation of double fertilization taking place. Double fertilization, meaning fertilization takes place twice. Now, because the polar nuclei were diploid already, and they fuse with the male gamete, they become triploid, 3N. And the egg itself becomes diploid, and the egg will become the diploid zygote. The zygote will divide to form the embryo, and the embryo then is found in the seed. The seed is inside the fruit. When an animal eats the fruit, or if the fruit simply falls off the tree and withers, the seed then goes into the ground and germinates back into what we can see as a plant. So again, a diploid sporophyte generation alternating with a haploid gametophyte generation. Notice where in the moss, the gametophyte generation was the plant we saw. In flowering plants, the sporophyte generation is the plant we see. Also notice that in the angiosperms, the gametophyte generation is very reduced. It's reduced to the pollen grain and the embryo sac. Those 2 things represent the gametophyte generation in angiosperms. Just to show you a line diagram of the similar concept, this is what we are seeing here. What we're having is the sporophyte generation undergoes meiosis, forming the megaspores and the microspores. These are N, that is 2N obviously. And these mega gametophyte, the gametophyte from there, and the microgametophyte. In other words, the pollen and the egg fuse, fertilization takes place. This gives rise to the seed. The seed undergoes mitosis to form the big plant that we see. Again, as you can see, above there is 2N, below is N. Haploid, diploid. Oh, this is what we mean by life cycle. The main thing that you need to know in this area, guys, is a diagram like this. You do not have to go into all the details. You need to know the diagram and how it goes on this way in terms of that. Typical exam question, they give you a diagram like this. They leave out certain areas. They ask you questions on this. So make sure that you understand this diagram and the one that we did on the moss, because those are the 2 that are prescribed for your syllabus. Lots of textbooks have the life cycle of the fern as well in the book, but the life cycle of the fern is not prescribed for examination. It's not examinable. The only 2 that you need to know properly are that of the moss and the angiosperm. We move on to animals now, and we talk about metamorphosis. What is metamorphosis? It refers to a change in body form from the stage of the egg to the stage of the adult. Some organisms, like us, you and I, we undergo no metamorphosis. When we are born, the structures that we have, more or less, are already there, and we then grow as individuals. Only growth takes place. We do not become something else, and then become where we are as adults. We are born alive, first of all. We're viviparous, so we are born alive, and we'll talk more about vivipary and ovipary when we talk about reproductive strategies later. But now we're looking at this metamorphosis, and we talk about complete metamorphosis. When we talk about complete metamorphosis, we talk of metamorphosis where all 4 stages occur. And the stages are beautifully put out in this particular diagram or flowchart of the life cycle of a butterfly. The first one is the egg, then it's the larva, Then it's the pupa, larva. The caterpillar is the larva. And then we have this chrysalis, which is the pupa. And from there we get the adult butterfly. So the butterfly has to change its life cycle to become the adult that we see. And then the adult will lay eggs and the cycle will continue. So because all 4 stages are present, we say that this is complete metamorphosis. And a locust displays incomplete metamorphosis. There's the adult. Here's the adult locust. She's laying, this is a female obviously, laying eggs using the ovipositor into the ground. When the eggs hatch, this is what we see. Now look at this picture and look at the adult. And you'll notice clearly, guys, stark reality should hit you compared to the other one. This particular fellow here, which by the way we can call the hopper, is a miniature adult. The main thing that it lacks is the size of the adult, and it does not have wings. Hence we call it hopper. It does not fly, it hops along. And this then will molt. The hopper actually gets onto a tree or a leaf, hangs upside down, the exoskeleton is shed, and then it gets bigger, and the next one comes out that way. By the way, this is the reason why metamorphosis takes place in these insects. Because they have an exoskeleton, the skeleton cannot grow with the body. The skeleton is outside the body. So the body is growing, but the skeleton has to stay the same size. This is no good. So what must happen is, when this organism is growing, it must first get rid of the exoskeleton, and a new exoskeleton is then laid as it's growing up there. And as you can see, it will go through about 5 stages of metamorphosis, or 5 changes of molting rather, and then not 5 stages of metamorphosis, let's correct that properly. It's the 5 stages of molting, which is part of the incomplete metamorphosis of this organism. So the main key here, you can see that the young that came out of the egg skipped a stage. Okay, it skipped a stage. It looks very similar to the adult. I'll give you a second to have a look at that diagram so you know exactly what is happening there. Good, I gave you a couple of seconds, that's good enough. Other animals still show other forms of asexual reproduction. For example, budding. Now anybody that has seen the movie Gremlins, Gremlins 1, Gremlins 2, Gremlins 3, there was an incorrect portrayal of this budding process. If you remember, the good guy, the good gremlin, if water got onto his body, then little buds would form on his body, and these buds will pop, and these buds became different organisms. But in that movie, all the organisms that came out of there, they all were different. They did not even look close to the one that was there. They were different one, the gangster, the mafiosi, the criminal. They were all different. It's not possible. If mitosis takes place, then obviously all the organisms that come out of there must look the same. So what happens here is a bud grows out of the organism. The bud breaks off, and when large enough, it falls off. And the examples are the yeast and the hydra. We're going to look at one of those 2 examples. The hydra, there you have a hydra. There's the bud forming there. Here's another bud forming there. And when this bud becomes big enough and it has all the body layers, it will fall off the organism, and it will represent the same animal in growth in terms of mitosis later and become bigger. Here's another diagram showing you the same thing. There's one hydra there. From this hydra comes another one. Obviously, the genes in this hydra will be the same genes on this hydra because there was no meiosis, there was no crossing over, etc. There was no exchange of gametes at all. This organism gave rise to another organism from itself, similar to what we would call cloning in different forms. Another way is regeneration. Please don't try this at home. Where here, living organisms repair themselves by growing lost body parts from the remaining cells. A main example that we will discuss here are the lizards. And there's a diagram there of a lizard without its tail. Now, if the lizard loses its tail, and it likes to do this if it's being chased by a predator, what it does is it breaks off the tail then wiggles to distract the predator, and the lizard gets away. The lizard itself now will not stay without a tail forever. A new tail grows there, and this is known as regeneration. Certain roundworms as well, if you cut the body, each of the two parts can grow up on their own. Even some Spirogyra algae, green algae, if you break a strand, each strand can become a new strand on its own. This is also regeneration. There's different stages showing you there. Now we're moving on to the sexual reproduction. Obviously, in all these organisms, plants, fungi, protists, animals, etc., for sexual reproduction to take place, you obviously need two parents. And these two parents have to be a male and a female. Because the male must give us the male gamete or sperm, and the female must give us the female gamete or egg. Not necessarily only sperm. Remember, in the plant, that was a pollen grain which had a male gamete in it. So we're talking of the male gamete there. So that's the basic requirements for sexual reproduction. And what happens here? The sperm fertilizes the egg, and we've seen this in the life cycle. We're just reinforcing that. And that becomes a zygote, which is diploid. Repeated divides how? Repeatedly. By mitosis. Okay? And what happens then? The embryo develops into a fetus, in our case, and some animals, and from there, an offspring is born. Obviously, this is typical of mammals and other viviparous organisms. There's a diagram showing you, I didn't disappoint you, I did show you one diagram on sexual reproduction. There you have the sperm, the egg, fertilization takes place, zygote becomes the embryo becomes a baby in our case. I would not go further than this slide. I hand over to Ty.
Okay, and on that note, whew, that is a lot of information. But mindsetters, make sure you stay tuned and do not go anywhere. Make sure you stick around, and if you have to go to the bathroom, go get snacks, whatever you need to do, but make sure you come back. It's very, very important. We've got something special happening in the next segment. So make sure you stay tuned. See you soon.